Hi, this is Ethan Tapper, the Chittenden County Forester, and I'm here to answer your questions about Vermont's forests. And so it's really important to understand, first of all, that Vermont is mostly forested. So about 75% of Vermont is forested. 80% of those lands are owned by private landowners. And so we all enjoy the benefits of forests. So they clean our air, they clean our water, they provide a wildlife habitat, carbon sequestration and storage, and many, many other services. And so while 80% of Vermont's forests are privately owned, these are all public benefits that we all enjoy. And so the activities of private landowners, people who have just a piece of property from a couple acres to hundreds or thousands of acres in size, are doing us all a great service. And so that's the first thing to understand. The second thing to understand is Vermont's land use history. If we were all standing here, right now I'm in Essex Junction, if you were pretty much anywhere in the state, what you would see is a landscape that looks really different from the landscape we have now. So in the 1800s, between about 1800 and about 1850, Vermont's forests were clear-cut. And the reason for that was sheep pasture. So the Napoleonic Wars were occurring in Europe. Napoleon was invading lots of European countries, and there was a special kind of sheep called the merino sheep. That may sound familiar to you. We still get a lot of our wool today from merino sheep. Of course, now that's mostly from New Zealand, places like that. But at the time, it was this really, really rare, important, and valuable commodity. Following the Napoleonic Wars, there was merino sheep that were owned by the King of Spain. And there was all this chaos related to the wars. And as a result of that, a bunch of these merino sheep were finally allowed to be exported. Prior to that, they had been just in Spain. And they were exported by this guy named William Jarvis, who was at the time the United States Consul to Portugal, who exported them to his farm in Wethersfield, Vermont. And so by the early 1800s, there was somewhere between 1 to 1.7 million merino sheep in Vermont, many more sheep than there were people. And the wool was very high in quality, it was worth a lot more money, and so people just started clearing everything. So by 1850, we think that about 80% of our landscape was cleared. What that means is that pretty much every forest you've ever been in, except for very remote, inaccessible, steep areas, were pasture at that time, and they were all cleared not with chainsaws and big equipment, but actually with draft animals like oxen and draft horses, cross-cut saws pulled by hand, axes. It's pretty amazing. Forests develop as systems. So an old growth forest is a forest that has had minimal human intervention for hundreds or thousands of years. Our forests, most of them, are, as a result of that past landscape level clearing, pretty much less than 100 or 150 years old. So they haven't really had time to develop into the old growth forests that covered about 90 to 95% of Vermont prior to the 1800s. And so as the result of that, our forests look really, really different. So behind me, what you see is a field, which is now reverting back into forested land, very, very slowly. And so most of the little trees behind me are pines. White pine in particular is really, really good at growing in these old fields. And so many of the young forests we have are dominated by white pine trees. Not because it's necessarily a great place for growing white pine trees, but just because they're really good at growing in these old fields. So what you can see behind me is sort of the beginning of this process of what we call forest succession, or the way that forests grow and change over time. What is it about white pine that makes it so good at growing in these old fields? There's a few different theories about this. One of them is that as these fields were reverting back to forest, they were being actively grazed by livestock. So they were being grazed by sheep, they were being grazed by cows. These ungulates, these pastoral animals which were grazing these areas, have preferences. So they like to graze certain things, they like to graze other things less. In many cases, they like to graze our deciduous tree species, hardwood species, more than they like to graze are coniferous species, softwood species like white pine. Another really interesting theory is that the way that forests develop from fields back into forests is influenced by meadow voles. So meadow voles have similar preferences, and what they might have done is girdled many of the young hardwood trees, deciduous trees, and left the white pine. And so this would greatly influence the forest that resulted from this pasture abandonment and led to, in many cases, a monoculture of eastern white pine in these old fields. Now, as these forests developed out of these old fields, many of them dominated by white pine, others of them dominated by other species, what happens is what you see behind me. So this is a young forest, and it's what we call an even-aged forest. So all of these trees are about the same size and age as a result of all starting at the same time. So they started at a field, no trees growing at all, and they all started growing at about the same time, and the result of this is a forest where most of the trees are about the same height, most of the trees are about the same age. Now, while this occurred 200 or 300 years ago in our landscape in small pockets, usually as a result of a natural disturbance like a windstorm or something like that, it was relatively rare. What was much more common were forests that were dominated by trees of all different sizes and ages. So what would happen is there would be more small-scale disturbances, a tree would fall over, there would be a little wind microburst creating a little pocket of open space and light, and what would result in that pocket was regeneration, a small area of trees that were all about the same size originating from that disturbance. That would not occur over large areas. But in Vermont, what we see more often than not is these even-aged forests that are all about the same age because they're all originating from old pastures. And so what happens in these even-aged forests is all the trees are competing with each other very aggressively. The canopies are very, very tightly knit together. And you don't see those different canopy layers that you would have seen with old growth forests because there's just not enough light reaching the forest floor. There aren't old trees, which are very, very important to old growth forests and which we would have found a lot of in these old growth forests. And now a role that humans can have in the management of forests that can be positive is helping our even-aged forests, these forests which largely are the result of human land use, become more like old growth forests. At the same time, we can manage them to have better wildlife habitat, to sequester and store more carbon, to be more resilient to the effects of climate change, and we can do that in a few different ways. Just managing for multiple sizes and ages of trees by creating natural disturbances, so cutting trees in small pockets to create little pockets of regeneration, will make our forest more resilient to disturbances. Multi-aged forests with more than one dominant age of trees, will also sequester and store more carbon in the long term. In an environment where we also understand that our climate is changing and that's going to put a lot of stresses on our trees, eliminating the stresses of competition, so cutting trees which are competing with our highest quality trees, will make it so that they don't have to get stressed out competing with their neighbors. They can just focus on growing, and then when something happens, if the climate changes or they're threatened by an invasive exotic pest or something like that, they'll have more energy that they will have saved by not competing with their neighbors to defend themselves. We also know that there are species of wildlife, like birds, who require different canopy layers, like you would find in these old growth or uneven aged forests. And so by making our forests more diverse, by providing different types of habitat, different sizes and ages of trees, we also know that we will be improving the quality of wildlife habitat that's available for our wildlife. Now, having different sizes and ages of trees like you would in a multi-aged or old growth forest, we call that structural diversity. What's also important is what we call species diversity. So species diversity is just having lots of different trees of different species that are present in a given forest. And the reason for that is because diversity is the spice of life in more ways than one. So different tree species provide different benefits to our forests. Because our forests function as systems, we understand that all the different parts are all really, really important. You can also break that down, so different species will react differently to a changing climate, so give the forest sort of more tools to deal with climate change. Different species will also provide different opportunities for wildlife, so different wildlife species will require different species of trees for shelter, for foraging food, for raising their young and reproducing. So for all these reasons, diversity is incredibly important. So as we manage our forests for the future, for their health, for all of these different things and all these different public benefits that they provide, diversity is really, really important. And one of the questions I always ask is there a role that humans can play in the management of our forests, an active role that will actually be positive for their growth and well-being? And I think in light of all these different things and considering all of these different aspects and attributes of forests, the answer is yes. So please send me your questions about forests, about forest management, and I'll see if I can answer them for you. Thank you.